Okay, I just want to respond real quick. I was going through some comments and responses. One of the things somebody said here, he says, and I want to address this specifically. I was talking to Terminator, I believe it's supposed to be Terminator, but anyway, but whatever, you're all so wrong. These historians can be dismissed. You have to do me a favor and Google contemporaneous corroboration. Every piece of documentation outside the Bible about events in the Bible are flimsy at best. Well, first off, that's completely untrue. In fact, these extra-biblical sources that vindicate and validate the biblical record are recognized by the vast majority of all secular historians. Number one, as authentic. Number two, the letters of Paul, and we cannot dismiss them regardless of whether they're in the Bible or not. All, or virtually all, secular historians agree that Paul wrote those books. Therefore, it is a historical document. And as one of the people on my profile pointed out, that the vast majority of the things that we have, well, just read it. I believe this is it. They said, he says, I can't believe the woman's claim. Any objective historian worth their salt would consider it foolish to flatly deny the actual existence of Jesus, and to disregard all Christian sources is ridiculous. And I agree with them. It is ridiculous. And why? They explain. Most of the things that we know about certain cultures and historical figures in history in the past are mostly, or even exclusively, written by the very same people that belong to those groups. If we were to dismiss the biblical account, the Gospels, Paul's letters, which all historians, secular historians, or the vast majority of them anyway, agree wrote those books, and the 17 extra biblical accounts outside of the Bible, or even without the 17 extra biblical accounts, if we were just to dismiss the Bible as not being historically valid, then all records of ancient history would also have to be discarded. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you an example. Caesar's Gallic Wars. We only have 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars from the original. And the first of those 10 copies was written nearly 1,000 years after the fact. 1,000 years after the fact. With the Bible, however, from the original manuscripts, the earliest copies of those manuscripts came 100 to 150 years. Far shorter time period, far shorter likelihood of change within that time period. Not to mention the fact that Luke and Mark are dated within the 1st century, as is the book of Acts. And Paul's letters most definitely are within 1st century AD, 1st century Christianity. Historians all know this. Mark was written about anywhere from 30 to 50 years after the original events with Jesus. We know Luke was 1st century because it came before the book of Acts. It was written before the book of Acts, and we know Paul was still alive at that time. And Paul was 1st century. And therefore, everything that Paul wrote was also 1st century, documenting the history very adamantly, very admirably in the New Testament. And then outside of that, we have 17 extra biblical accounts verifying the gospel messages from 17 other people that we consider credible in other areas. Many of these people, we have drawn upon information from them regarding other historical facts, like, for example, Pliny the Younger, Tertullian, and the Emperor Julian and whatnot, and different others. Many of them that are in that list, we have drawn information from regarding other events, and yet we're going to reject them in regard to the Christian record, in regard to the authenticity of the Christian record. And so, to say that they're flimsy at best, well, they're recognized by secular historians, so that is false. In addition to that, Caesar's Gallic Wars is a document that no historian disputes that Caesar's Gallic War happened, and yet the earliest surviving manuscript from the original, we only have 10 copies in history left intact, and the earliest of those was written nearly 1,000 years after the fact. And in addition to that, we don't have upwards of 17 outside documents from Caesar's Gallic Wars to validate the authenticity of Caesar's Gallic Wars. And yet, in spite of the fact that they don't have the backup histories from other sources, historians all agree that Caesar's Gallic Wars is a historical fact. And yet, they want to reject the Bible. And why? Because reprobate men would rather turn the truth into a lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So in an attempt to quiet God's voice, so that they don't have to listen to their own conscience, they reject any evidences, whether it's documented in history or not. And in terms of the Bible and the New Testament, as well as the Old, but the New as well, and the early church and stuff, there is more documentation of the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ than any single event we can find in ancient history. For that matter, there is more evidence, there is more external evidence for many of the things that happened with Jesus' life than there is even with George Washington, our own president. And that was only some 200 years ago, a little over 200 years ago. So to say that we're going to reject these other documents that validate the Bible and whatnot, that's just being historically biased. And it's because people do not want to have to come face to face with the living God. The Bible is the all-time bestseller of all time. It has been studied, it has been questioned by more people in more generations than any other book of its kind in human history. That, when you take a look at Jesus, here is a man. He was born, he was not born in princely estate. He was born in obscurity, in a little corner of the world, in a small nation. He had a ministry that lasted only 3 years. And yet in that 3 years he has impacted world history and world events more powerfully than any man before his time or since. Greater, indeed, was his mark upon this earth than the greatest kings and priests and princes that have ever lived. And indeed, in his time he said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away." He said that. What an arrogant statement for some obscure prophet in a very small nation that was hardly even known by the world to say. And yet, 2,000 years later, when all other tongues are silenced, yet his voice is still heard. How much more proof do you want?